Chapter 1: The Whispers in the Walls. The rain battered against the ancient windows of Black Hollow Manor, each drop echoing like a faint heartbeat through the cavernous hallways. Elise stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, staring into the dimly lit interior where shadows stretched like claws across the marble floor. She was here to catalog the house's remaining antiques for auction, a job she had reluctantly accepted. But as soon as she stepped inside, an inexplicable chill coiled up her spine, and the air smelled faintly of earth and iron. Somewhere deep within the manor, she swore she heard a low murmur, a whisper so soft it was almost swallowed by the storm. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls lined with faded portraits of grim-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. She tried to shake the feeling, but when she passed one particular painting of a woman in black lace, she thought she saw the figure blink. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and she quickly turned away, convincing herself it was just the lightning outside playing tricks. As she set her suitcase on a dusty bench and turned to close the door, she noticed something odd. The door didn't have a lock. Only a strange sigil was carved where a keyhole should have been, and it pulsed faintly under her touch. Elise explored the main hall, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet, while her flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a blade. The house groaned around her, as though it was alive and restless, and she could swear the wallpaper patterns shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. In the dining room, the long table was still set with tarnished silverware and cracked china plates, and on each plate lay a black feather. She reached out to touch one, but before her fingers could make contact, a cold breath blew across her hand and extinguished her flashlight. The darkness that followed was thick and pressing, as though it had substance of its own. Her breath came faster now, misting in the freezing air as she fumbled to relight the torch. When the beam flickered back to life, she found herself staring at the dining room mirror, but her reflection wasn't alone. Standing behind her in the glass was the woman from the painting, her face pale and hollow-eyed, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. Elise spun around, but the room behind her was empty. Yet the faint sound of thread tearing filled the silence, and the mirror surface began to ripple like water, distorting her reflection into something unrecognizable. Panic clawed at her chest as she backed into the hall, the flashlight stuttering and fading as if the very walls drank its light. The murmurs returned, louder now, distinct voices overlapping in a cacophony of anguish and laughter. One voice, deep, guttural, and inhuman, rose above the others, whispering her name. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers came from inside her head now, urging her to open a door she hadn't seen before at the end of the hallway, a door that hadn't been there moments earlier. Drawn despite herself, she approached the door, which was slick with moisture and covered in more of the strange sigil she had seen earlier. The wood felt warm under her fingers, almost as if it were alive, and the whispers fell silent the instant she touched it. For a fleeting moment, she considered turning back, but a sudden pressure, like hands on her back, shoved her forward and the door swung open with a sound like bones snapping. Beyond was not another room, but a stairway spiraling downward into impenetrable darkness. A cold draft seeped up from the stairwell, carrying with it the stench of rot and something metallic. She descended slowly, each step groaning in protest under her weight. The walls down here were slick and glistening as though they bled, and the faint light from above vanished as soon as she reached the first landing. Ahead, the stairs curved endlessly downward, but on the wall beside her she noticed something scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "Welcome home." Her pulse thundered in her ears as she continued downward, the silence broken only by her own ragged breathing and the occasional faint drip of water, or was it something thicker? She felt a presence behind her now, heavy and oppressive as though someone or something was descending with her, matching her every step. When she stopped to listen, the unseen footsteps stopped too, but she could feel hot breath on her neck and smell the faint scent of earth and decay. The urge to run was overpowering, but her legs refused to obey. Finally, she reached the bottom, where the stairway opened into a vast underground chamber lit by a dim red glow emanating from cracks in the stone floor. The walls were lined with ancient, jagged stones etched with more of those pulsating sigils. In the center of the room stood a circle of figures draped in shadowy robes, their faces obscured. They didn't move or speak as she entered, but their heads turned in perfect unison to face her. In their midst lay a black altar, and on it rested a familiar suitcase, her suitcase, though she had left it upstairs. Its latch clicked open by itself. The whispering returned with deafening intensity, echoing off the chamber walls, rising to a fevered pitch as the figures began to sway. The suitcase creaked as it opened fully, revealing a strange, writhing darkness within, like a nest of serpents made of shadow. The voices in her head screamed a single command, "Join us!" And the room seemed to tilt and warp around her. She felt herself being pulled forward against her will, the air thick with the smell of blood and something ancient awakening. The suitcase's darkness reached out like tendrils, wrapping around her ankles as she stumbled toward the altar, unable to look away. Chapter 2: The Hunger Below. Elise's body trembled as the darkness from the suitcase coiled around her legs and dragged her closer to the altar. Her fingernails scraped helplessly at the stone floor, sparks flying where she clung to the cracks, but the force pulling her was relentless, as though she were sinking into quicksand made of shadows. The robed figures remained perfectly still, their unseen eyes fixed on her as the suitcase opened wider, revealing a gaping void inside that pulsed like a black heart. The whispering rose to a deafening crescendo, each word drilling into her mind. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" With a final desperate scream, Elise tore one leg free and kicked the altar, toppling the suitcase to the floor. The darkness inside writhed furiously, but the tendrils recoiled as if stung by her defiance. She stumbled backward, gasping, but her reprieve was short-lived. The robed figures began to move at last, their hands emerging from the folds of their robes, long, bony fingers tipped with claws, as they reached toward her. Their chanting grew louder now, rhythmic and guttural, the very stones of the chamber vibrating underfoot. Elise bolted toward the stairway, her shoes slipping on the slick, blood-warmed stones. But when she reached the first step, she stopped cold. The stairs were no longer there. In their place yawned another abyss, darker than anything she'd ever seen, a chasm that swallowed her light and her hope whole. She stumbled back, looking wildly for another way out, but the chamber stretched infinitely around her now, as if the walls had dissolved and left her in a boundless, red-lit void. The air itself felt alive, thick and suffocating. Behind her, the suitcase began to rattle violently, its darkness spilling outward in jagged, writhing streams that painted the floor in sinister patterns. The robed figures began to converge on her, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hoods now revealing glimpses of pale, eyeless faces stitched crudely together. One of them extended a hand and brushed her arm, and an immediate icy numbness spread through her skin. Elise bit back a scream and staggered away, clutching her arm as dark veins snaked outward from where it had touched her. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air and the stone beneath her feet gave way. She fell, plummeting through blackness, her scream swallowed by the vast, hollow space below. The fall seemed endless, the air growing colder and wetter as she descended, until she landed abruptly on a soft, spongy surface that reeked of rot. Dazed and gasping, she forced herself to her knees and looked around. The floor beneath her was a patchwork of flesh and stone, and strange, root-like tendrils pulsed faintly under the surface, as if she were standing on something alive. All around her, the cavern walls glistened with a sickly red light emanating from cracks above, and the whispers returned, softer this time, coaxing rather than commanding. Shapes moved just beyond her vision, slithering along the edges of the chamber, and she caught glimpses of teeth and eyes peeking out from between folds of shadow. Somewhere far off, she heard what sounded like children laughing, though the sound was warped, distorted, as though it were coming from underwater. She covered her ears, but the laughter only grew louder, closer, until it was echoing inside her skull. Struggling to her feet, she stumbled toward what appeared to be an archway at the far side of the cavern, faintly outlined in the red glow. As she drew closer, she saw that it was not made of stone but of interwoven bones, slick with moisture and faintly humming with energy. Symbols she didn't recognize crawled across its surface, and the air grew colder with each step she took. Her breath came in frosty puffs now, and her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. Something inside her screamed to turn back, but her body moved forward of its own accord. She passed through the bone arch and into a narrow corridor lined with mirrors, each one cracked but still reflecting distorted images of herself. In one mirror, her eyes were black pits. In another, her mouth was sewn shut like the woman in the painting. In yet another, she was nothing but a hollow husk of skin draped over bones. As she moved, the reflections began to whisper to her, their voices mocking and cruel, revealing secrets she didn't know she had. "You've always belonged here," one hissed. "You let them in," another sneered. "You brought this on yourself," a third laughed. Her hands shook as she pressed forward, trying to ignore the voices and the growing weight in her chest. The end of the corridor loomed a massive door carved from black stone, its surface alive with writhing sigils that glowed faintly in the dark. A faint warmth radiated from the door, oddly inviting, and the whispers began to chant in unison, urging her closer. "Open it. Open it. Open it." She reached out with trembling fingers, unable to stop herself, and as her hand made contact, the sigils flared brightly, searing into her skin. The door swung inward with a sound like 1,000 wings unfurling, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the floor was covered in what looked like countless bodies, their faces twisted in silent screams. The center stood a massive stone throne, and seated upon it was a figure that was neither man nor beast, its form constantly shifting, impossible to fully comprehend. Its hollow eyes fixed on her, and a voice, deep, resonant, and inescapable, filled the air. "Welcome home, Elise," it said as the chamber doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. Chapter 3: The Throne of Shadows. The figure on the throne leaned forward, its form stretching and twisting unnaturally, as if it were made of smoke and sinew. Elise's breath hitched in her chest as she stood frozen, staring into its bottomless eyes. The thing's voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder, echoing inside her mind. "You have walked the path. You have opened the door. Now kneel." Her knees buckled without her consent, and she collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her palms pressing against the slick surface, which pulsed faintly beneath her touch, alive and warm like flesh. Around her, the bodies on the ground began to shift. Limbs twitched, mouths opened in silent screams, and the dead eyes followed her as if awakening. The robed figures emerged from the darkness once again, forming a perfect circle around the throne. Their hoods fell back, revealing faces stitched from mismatched flesh, eyes gleaming with malice. Creature on the throne extended one elongated finger, pointing toward her. "You have been chosen," it intoned. "You will drink from the well. You will join the chorus." Elise shook her head weakly, her voice cracking as she whispered, "No, I don't belong here. I don't." But her protest only drew a low chuckle from the thing, a sound like gravel grinding in a pit. The floor beneath her feet split open, and a pool of viscous, black liquid bubbled up from the depths, filling the air with the stench of blood and decay. "Drink," it commanded, and the robed figures began to chant, their dissonant voices rising in tempo. The black liquid rippled and stretched toward her lips as though it were alive, its surface dotted with tiny, writhing shapes. Her body refused to obey her will as the liquid crept up her chin and pressed against her mouth. The taste was foul, coppery and bitter, and she gagged as it forced its way down her throat. The whispers inside her mind became deafening, weaving into a single hypnotic command. Become one. Become whole. Her vision blurred, the chamber spinning wildly, and when she collapsed backward, she felt as though her very soul was being pulled from her body, stretched thin and wrapped in darkness. When the dizziness subsided, she found herself standing in the same chamber, but everything had changed. The walls were now covered in countless eyes, all blinking in perfect unison, following her every move. The bodies on the floor were gone, replaced by writhing black tendrils that slithered over the stones like restless serpents. Creature on the throne was larger now, its form even more monstrous and unknowable, its face a shifting mass of mouths and eyes. It spoke again, though its voice now came from everywhere at once. "You wear the mark. You are ours." Elise glanced at her hands and screamed. Her skin was no longer her own. It was inscribed with glowing sigils that burned and writhed, moving like living tattoos. Her reflection shimmered on the slick floor beneath her, but it showed a version of herself with black, hollow eyes and a stitched mouth, the same as the woman from the painting. The whispers taunted her mercilessly now. "You've always been here. You've always been one of us." The words rattled in her skull, and she clawed at her arms, desperate to tear the marks away. Suddenly, the air shifted, and a great wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the crimson light and plunging everything into a suffocating darkness. Shapes moved within the void, circling her, their presence heavy and suffocating. Cold fingers brushed her shoulders, her neck, her face, and each touch sent a shock of icy pain through her body. She stumbled toward the throne, her knees scraping against the stone, trying to speak, but her mouth would no longer obey her. Her lips were stitched shut, just like in the reflection. Through the oppressive blackness, a faint glow appeared ahead. The throne itself began to shine with a blinding white light that seared her eyes. The creature stood, its monstrous form growing until it filled the chamber. With one final earth-shaking roar, it reached down and placed its hands on her shoulders, its fingers digging into her flesh. The light engulfed her completely, and she felt herself unraveling, every fiber of her being dissolving into the air like ash. When the light faded, Elise opened her eyes to find herself alone, standing in an endless corridor of mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, hundreds of versions of herself, each more distorted than the last. Some had no eyes, some no mouth, and others were nothing but skeletons draped in skin. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the faint sound of her own breathing and the occasional creak of shifting glass. In the distance, at the very end of the corridor, a faint black door stood ajar. Compelled by something she couldn't name, she began to walk toward the door. The reflections whispered as she passed, their voices like knives scraping against glass. "Closer! Closer! Closer!" The door seemed to recede the further she walked, stretching away endlessly, yet she could not stop moving. With each step, the air grew colder, the whispers sharper, and the darkness more complete. When she finally reached the door, her trembling hand reached out once more, and as she touched the cold, black surface, it swung open with a shriek, revealing a darkness deeper than anything she had yet seen, and a voice from beyond that whispered, "Welcome to your true home." Chapter 4: The Corridor of Echoes. Elise stood on the threshold of the black door, her hands still resting on its frozen surface. The voice from beyond continued to whisper her name, each syllable dripping with venom and familiarity, until she could no longer tell if it belonged to someone else or to herself. Taking a shallow breath, she stepped into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind her with such force it shook the air, leaving her trapped in utter blackness that swallowed even the faint sound of her heartbeat. Her fingers grazed the walls on either side, but they felt soft and warm, like slick muscle rather than stone. The floor sloped downward into what seemed like an endless void. With each hesitant step, faint echoes of her footfalls reverberated in strange, uneven rhythms, as though something in the dark was walking alongside her, mocking her movements. Shapes moved just beyond the edges of her sight, glimpses of crooked limbs and glinting eyes, but no matter how fast she turned, nothing solid revealed itself. Then came the laughter again, children's voices, warped and distant, swelling into a cacophony that seemed to press against her skull from the inside. Her breath quickened as a faint red light began to seep from the cracks in the walls, illuminating a corridor of horrors. The walls were lined with hundreds of hands protruding from the flesh-like surface, each one reaching, grasping, and trembling as she passed. Their fingernails scraped along her coat, tugging at her hair, and she could feel their icy grip on her ankles. A chill settled deep into her bones, and though she tried to run, the corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, the door behind her now gone. One of the hands finally caught her wrist, its grip iron-strong, and she felt a hot whisper at her ear. "Stay!" She tore free with a sob, her skin burning where the hand had touched her, leaving a mark shaped like a black spiral that pulsed faintly. Ahead, the corridor widened into a massive hall where the red light blazed brighter, revealing a vast pit in the center of the room. Around the edges, stone plinths stood, each bearing a figure bound in chains and stitched shut at the eyes and mouth. Their heads twitched faintly as though aware of her presence. The whispers began again, louder now, chanting a single word in unison: "Descend!" Peering over the edge of the pit, Elise saw no bottom. Instead, the walls spiraled downward, carved with writhing sigils and faintly glowing veins of red light. The air rising from below was hot and fetid, thick with the scent of blood and sulfur. Against her will, she began to climb down, her fingers finding purchase in the slick, fleshy grooves. The chanting figures above continued to sway and murmur, their sound growing fainter as she descended into the suffocating dark. Her hands burned from the heat of the walls, but she didn't dare stop, as though an unseen force was urging her deeper. The pit grew narrower and more oppressive the further she went. Soon, she found herself crawling, her shoulders scraping against the walls, the whispers now a constant buzz in her mind. Just as the heat became unbearable, she tumbled onto a ledge and collapsed. Gasping for breath, she looked up to see the passage widen into a cavern of obsidian black stone, illuminated by thousands of candles whose flames burned a sickly green. The center stood a colossal statue, a grotesque creature with wings made of bone and a crown of thorns, its many eyes weeping black ichor that pooled at its feet. The ichor slithered across the floor, forming runes that glowed with faint life. As she approached the statue, the ichor rose into spindly shapes, forming clawed hands and gaping mouths that snapped at her ankles and wrists. The whispers changed, now calling her by name more insistently, Elise! Elise! Elise. Her legs trembled as she reached the base of the statue, where a small altar waited. On it lay a cracked mirror framed in bone. The surface of the mirror shimmered faintly, showing not her reflection but the stitched woman from the painting, smiling behind her sewn mouth. With a trembling hand, Elise touched the mirror. Instantly, the candles extinguished, plunging the cavern into silence and blackness. Then the mirror flared with light, and she felt herself being pulled inside, her limbs twisting, her skin crawling as her body folded into itself. She screamed, but no sound escaped her stitched lips, and the sensation of falling returned. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and cold. Then she landed hard on another surface, glassy and wet. She opened her eyes to find herself back in the corridor of mirrors, but the reflections were different now. Pain showed a different version of herself, some mutilated, some monstrous, all staring back with black, hollow eyes. Their whispers rose again, this time deafening and angry. Why did you leave? Why did you come back? Why won't you stay? She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices only grew louder, reverberating through her skull until she thought it would split open. In the distance, another door appeared. Smaller than before, its surface cracked and leaking faint tendrils of shadow. The mirrors began to shatter one by one as she passed them, shards raining down and cutting her skin. Blood streaked down her arms, but she pressed forward, drawn inexorably to the door. The air grew colder and heavier, the whispers now nothing but a guttural hum that shook the ground beneath her feet. When she finally reached the door, it opened before she could touch it, revealing nothing but blinding white light beyond. She hesitated on the threshold, but the corridor behind her collapsed, forcing her to step through. As she did, the light enveloped her, and the whispers stopped at last, replaced by a deafening silence that felt even worse. Ahead of her, she could just make out another throne, this one carved of bone and draped in flayed skins, and sitting upon it was a figure even larger and darker than the last. It raised its head slowly, and in a voice like a funeral bell it spoke, "We are not done with you." Chapter 5, The Bone Throne. Elise stood before the throne of bone and skin, her knees weak and her breath shallow. The figure upon it shifted, its bulk creaking like dead trees in a storm, and slowly leaned forward. Its presence pressed against her mind, a suffocating weight that made her head throb and her vision blur. "We are not done with you," it repeated, its voice reverberating through the white void like a chorus of mourners. The flayed skins draped over the throne quivered as though alive, their hollow eye sockets all turning toward her, and she felt their gaze burn into her flesh. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. The void around them stretched infinitely, and yet the figure's stare made it feel unbearably claustrophobic. Elise wanted to speak, to protest, to ask why, but her mouth was still sewn shut. Her fingers instinctively clawed at the stitches, tearing them free with a wet rip, blood trailing down her chin as she gasped in pain and fury. "Why me?" she cried hoarsely, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive air. The figure didn't answer, but instead raised one clawed hand and pointed behind her. She turned slowly and saw that the white void had fractured, revealing another corridor, this one narrower and darker, lined with countless doors. Each door was unique, some carved from wood, some of bone, others glistening as though made of flesh. "Choose," the figure intoned. The command shuddered through her bones, and without thinking, she began to walk toward the corridor, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the slick surface. The doors rattled and whispered as she passed, each one promising something or threatening it. Her hand hovered over a door carved with spiraling runes, its surface slick and warm. The whispers behind it were more frantic, more urgent than the rest. Before she could decide, the door burst open by itself and a torrent of black smoke poured out, wrapping around her like a shroud. She screamed as she was yanked inside. Her body dragged through the opening as the door slammed shut behind her. When the smoke cleared, she was standing in yet another chamber, this one made entirely of mirrors, each taller than a man and cracked at the edges. Her reflection stared back at her from all angles, but the faces in the mirrors weren't quite hers anymore. They grinned at her with too many teeth, their hollow eyes following her like predators. Some had no skin at all, others wept black ichor that pooled at her feet. The air here was freezing, and the smell of iron and rot was suffocating. Slowly, the reflections began to speak in unison, their voices rasping and cruel. "You can't leave. You never left. You are the door." The words crawled inside her skull and settled there like worms. One by one, the mirrors began to crack and shatter, shards of glass flying through the air to slice her skin. She spun wildly, trying to find the exit, but every direction was the same. More mirrors, more reflections, more mocking whispers. Finally, a single mirror at the far end of the room remained intact, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. She stumbled toward it, blood dripping from dozens of cuts on her arms and legs, her breath ragged and shallow. When she reached it, the surface of the glass rippled like water. Against her will, her hands pressed to the mirror and it swallowed her whole. The sensation was like plunging into ice water, her lungs seizing as she was pulled deeper and deeper. When she emerged on the other side, she found herself kneeling on a floor of slick black stone, the air thick with ash and the acrid scent of burning flesh. Above her loomed yet another throne, taller and more grotesque than the last, its back adorned with writhing figures trapped in agony. The figure seated there was faceless, its head a mass of wriggling tendrils that writhed with every breath. Its presence was even more suffocating than the first, and its voice was softer but more insidious, slithering directly into her mind. "You are the key," it whispered. "You are the gate. Open yourself and let us through." The tendrils on its head reached out toward her, brushing her cheek and leaving trails of searing pain. She staggered backward, clutching her head as visions flooded her mind. Countless worlds swallowed in darkness, cities reduced to dust, oceans boiling with black ichor, all while the whispers chanted her name in a triumphant, maddening rhythm. On the floor before the throne, a circle of symbols began to glow, and at its center lay a dagger forged from obsidian and bone. The voice hissed, "Choose." Elise crawled forward, her hands trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the hilt of the dagger. The instant she touched it, her skin erupted with fresh sigils, burning white-hot and twisting across her arms and neck. The reflections in the shattered fragments around her screamed, their faces melting away as she lifted the dagger. She rose to her feet, the dagger heavy in her hand, and the figure on the throne tilted its faceless head toward her as though waiting. The circle of symbols flared brighter, and the whispers reached a fever pitch, all of them shouting in unison now, "Open the gate! Open the gate! Open the gate!" Elise raised the dagger high above her head, her entire body trembling with pain and rage, and with a final guttural cry she brought it down, and the throne erupted in a blinding storm of light and darkness, swallowing everything around her in an explosion of unearthly power. Chapter 6: The Shattered Gate. The storm of light and darkness roared around Elise, ripping at her skin and hair as if the void itself wanted to devour her. The whispers became screams, then silence, and when the maelstrom subsided, she found herself lying on a cracked obsidian floor, the dagger still clutched tightly in her bloodied hand. The throne was gone, replaced by a massive jagged archway that pulsed with a malignant energy. Through its fractured surface, she glimpsed an endless expanse of black oceans and twisted spires, where shadows moved like predators just out of sight. The air itself trembled with anticipation, thick with the smell of ash and iron. Her knees buckled as she rose, the sigils carved into her skin still glowing faintly, their heat now a constant throb rather than searing pain. She staggered closer to the archway, feeling an invisible pull that dragged her toward it despite every instinct screaming to turn back. The whispers returned, softer now, almost reverent, and they spoke in unison. "The gate is open! Step through and become." She stopped at the very threshold, staring into the void beyond, her reflection in the shimmering surface no longer her own but a hollow-eyed creature stitched together by shadow. Behind her, the cavern began to quake, stones splintering as the robed figures emerged again from the darkness. They moved faster this time, their clawed hands reaching, their guttural chants echoing off the walls. Their hoods slipped, revealing faces even more monstrous than before. Skinless, eyeless, their mouths split wide into impossible grins. They circled her, cutting off any escape, their bodies weaving into a grotesque tapestry of flesh and shadow that writhed with hunger. "Step through," they demanded, their voices now sharp and commanding. Elise raised the dagger, its blade vibrating as if alive. The figures recoiled slightly at the sight of it, their chanting faltering. A strange strength surged through her veins, not her own but something darker and colder, and she spun toward the nearest figure, slashing the blade across its chest. Creature shrieked, collapsing into a heap of black smoke and bone shards. The others hesitated, but quickly pressed forward again, their claws raking the air, the whispers turning into howls of fury and fear. Desperation took hold, and she slashed at them wildly, the dagger cutting through flesh and shadow alike. Each strike sent up clouds of ash that clung to her skin, burning faintly, but the robed figures kept coming, inexhaustible, relentless. As they closed in, she felt her back press against the archway, the chill of the gate seeping into her bones. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and a roar erupted from the void beyond, shaking the cavern so violently that the robed figures stumbled and fell silent. From within the gate, a massive shape began to emerge. It was impossible to comprehend, a being of shifting darkness and blinding light, its form flickering between monstrous and divine. Filled the space with an oppressive gravity, the weight of its presence nearly crushing Elise where she stood. One by one, the robed figures fell to their knees, their heads bowing low as the creature's many eyes, scattered across its shifting body, fixed on her. A single word thundered from the void, so loud it felt as though it split her soul in two: "Choose." Her grip on the dagger tightened, her mind torn between leaping into the gate or turning the blade on herself. The whispers in her head multiplied, arguing, pleading, threatening, seducing, an unbearable cacophony that made her drop to her knees, clutching her head. The archway's surface began to warp and tear, showing glimpses of cities on fire, oceans boiling black, the sky raining with bodies, and through it all the creature waited, its presence both patient and insistent. "Choose," it repeated, quieter now but somehow more dangerous. Blood trickled from her ears and nose as she rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with a strange resolve. She turned the dagger in her hands and looked up at the creature, meeting its infinite gaze. The silence that followed was absolute. Then she lifted the blade high and slammed it into the archway itself. The dagger sank deep, and the gate let out a scream, not hers, not human, but something ancient and furious, as cracks spread across its surface like lightning. The robed figures shrieked and dissolved into ash, their chants cut short as the archway began to crumble. The void beyond writhed and shuddered, the creature within thrashing in anger and agony, its shape collapsing inward. A deafening roar filled the cavern, and the ground split apart beneath her feet. She clung to the hilt of the dagger, still embedded in the gate, as the entire structure shattered, releasing a shockwave that hurled her backward into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was lying alone in the ruins of the throne room. The archway was nothing but rubble now, the robed figures gone, the whispers finally silent. The air was cold and still, and her skin no longer glowed. In her hand, the dagger had turned to dust, leaving only black ash smeared across her palm. And yet, from somewhere deep below, far beyond the silence, she thought she heard it again. Faint, patient, inevitable. The creature's voice whispering, "We are not done with you." Chapter 7. The Awakening Below. Elise lay motionless on the cracked stone floor, her breath shallow and her skin slick with sweat and blood. The silence was deafening now, but somewhere deep inside her chest she could still feel the faint thrum of that creature's whisper, distant yet intimate, like a memory she could never quite forget. The ruins of the shattered gate loomed around her, jagged fragments jutting upward like broken teeth, and the ash of the robed figures swirled faintly in the still air. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to rest, but something inside told her that stopping here would mean surrendering to whatever still waited below. With trembling arms, she pushed herself to her knees. The glow of the sigils on her skin had faded, leaving behind faint scars that throbbed under her fingertips. The dagger's ash stained her palms, and though it had disintegrated, she could feel a phantom weight where it had been, as though it had buried itself in her bones. Above her, the void ceiling had cracked open, revealing nothing but blackness veined with faint streaks of crimson light, and a faint breeze swept down from the cracks, carrying the sour scent of rot and earth. Then, from the rubble of the gate, a faint sound began to rise. It was not the whispers this time, but a low, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, deep, ancient, and powerful. The stones at her feet began to quiver with each beat, and small tendrils of black smoke coiled up from the floor around her, winding themselves into strange, fleeting shapes before fading again. She staggered backward as the largest piece of the gate began to shift, sliding aside to reveal a spiral staircase leading downward, its steps slick with something that shimmered like oil. The heartbeat grew louder, resonating through her ribs, and she realized with a shiver that it was coming from below. Her first step onto the staircase sent a shudder through the entire cavern, and the faint light from the ceiling above dimmed, swallowed by the darkness that rose to meet her. The air was heavy now, so thick it felt like she was wading through it, and the walls of the stairwell pulsed faintly, alive with veins of black ichor. She descended slowly, her bare feet slipping on the wet stone, each step a struggle against the instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not anymore. Something deep below was calling her, and she could no longer pretend she hadn't heard it. The staircase spiraled deeper than she thought possible, and the air grew colder with each turn. Her breath came in frosty plumes now, and her skin prickled as unseen eyes seemed to watch her from just beyond the darkness. Strange markings lined the walls here, not the sigils she'd seen before, but crude, clawed scratches that bled faintly, as though the stone itself were wounded. The heartbeat was louder now, and with it came a faint whisper threading through the rhythm, "You are almost here!" The words seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating in her bones. At last, the stairs ended at a wide, open chamber that stretched so far she couldn't see its edges. The floor here was glassy and black, reflecting her distorted image beneath her feet, and at its center lay a massive, circular pit that glowed faintly from within. Tendrils of smoke rose from the pit's edge, and as she approached, the smell of iron and rot became overpowering, making her stomach churn. The heartbeat was deafening now, and she dropped to her knees at the pit's edge, peering down into the void below. Inside, something moved. A vast shape, coiled and writhing, its surface slick and glistening like oil. Countless eyes opened along its length, fixing on her all at once, their gaze searing into her mind. She gasped, clutching her head as visions flooded her. Cities drowned in black seas, stars falling from the sky, mountains of bone rising from the earth, all while the creature below rose higher and higher toward her. Its voice, deeper and more terrible than ever, filled the chamber. "You have awakened me, and you will feed me." The edges of the pit cracked and crumbled as the creature's tendrils stretched upward, winding around her legs and arms, lifting her off the ground. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but the tendrils held fast, pulling her closer to the yawning void below. The eyes along the creature's body blinked in eerie unison, and its breath, hot and wet, washed over her, smelling of earth and decay. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard herself screaming, though the sound was swallowed quickly by the darkness around her. Just as the creature's maw began to open, a cavernous, endless abyss lined with teeth that glistened like black glass, she caught sight of a faint glow at the far side of the chamber. Suspended above the pit was another mirror, larger than any she had seen, its surface shimmering like water. Inside the mirror she saw herself, whole and unmarked, standing defiantly with the dagger in hand. The reflection raised its weapon, and she felt something ignite deep inside her chest, a faint flicker of resistance against the suffocating darkness. Creature paused, its tendrils tightening but its many eyes turning toward the mirror. The reflection spoke, though she couldn't hear the words, and then thrust the dagger forward, its blade piercing through the glass, sending a blinding flash of light across the chamber. The tendrils around her loosened, and the creature howled in fury and pain, its body recoiling into the pit. Elise fell to the ground, gasping as the heartbeat faltered, replaced by a deafening silence. She turned her eyes to the shattered mirror, its pieces falling into the void, and heard, faint but clear, her own voice from somewhere beyond. Not yet! Chapter 8: The Mirror's Betrayal. Elise lay gasping on the cold, glassy floor, her body trembling as the last shards of the mirror dissolved into the pit below. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream, pressing against her chest and making it hard to breathe. The faint glow in the chamber dimmed, and the tendrils of the creature retreated slowly into the depths, its many eyes blinking shut one by one. The heartbeat faded to a faint echo, though she could still feel it somewhere far below, patient and watchful. She staggered to her feet, her skin slick with sweat and ash, and turned her gaze to where the mirror had once hovered. In its place now was only a faint shimmer in the air, as though the mirror's essence lingered, waiting. She approached cautiously, her reflection faint but visible, warped and twisted like something half-submerged in water. This time, however, the reflection did not mirror her movements. Stood still, watching her with hollow eyes, its stitched mouth slowly opening to reveal a dark void inside. A whisper slithered from the reflection's mouth, sharp and mocking. "You thought you could break the gate? Fool. You are the gate." The words struck her like knives, and the reflection raised a hand, pressing its palm to the surface. Elise stumbled backward as the shimmer rippled violently, and the surface of the air cracked like ice. A sudden force slammed into her chest, throwing her across the chamber and into the wall. Pain shot through her ribs as she crumpled to the floor, coughing. The reflection stepped through the broken surface, emerging into the chamber, no longer just a phantom in glass but solid and alive. Smiled with her own mouth, its eyes black pits that swallowed the faint light. Around them, the whispers returned, louder than ever, chanting, "One must remain. One must feed." The doppelganger raised its hands, and the shards of the broken mirror rose from the pit, spinning through the air like blades. Elise scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged, and felt an old strength surge through her veins, the same cold, alien force she'd felt when she wielded the dagger. Though her hands were empty now, the sigils on her skin began to glow faintly again, and the whispers faltered for just a heartbeat. She fixed her eyes on the thing that wore her face and hissed through gritted teeth, "I am not yours." Her reflection tilted its head and laughed, a sound like glass breaking and wind screaming through a crypt. The shards flew toward her, and she ducked, rolling to the side as they embedded in the floor where she'd stood. Her own voice echoed from the creature, mocking her, "You always were. You opened the door. You called us." Elise lunged forward, striking the doppelganger with her bare hands. To her shock, the creature staggered backward, the sigils on her palms searing into its flesh, leaving blackened scars. The creature screamed, her scream, and the chamber shuddered as cracks spread across the floor. Pit below roared to life again, tendrils lashing upward, blindly striking at both of them. The heartbeat thundered, angry now, and the whispers rose into a shriek. Elise pressed her advantage, driving the doppelganger back toward the pit. It lashed out, claws raking her arm, but she ignored the pain, her entire body alight with that strange energy. As they reached the edge of the pit, the creature caught her by the throat and lifted her off the ground. Her feet kicked uselessly as the thing's hollow eyes bore into hers, the pit yawning below. "You cannot destroy what you are," it hissed. But just as its claws began to tighten, Elise reached out and pressed her glowing palm to its chest. A brilliant light erupted, blinding them both, and the doppelganger shrieked as its body cracked and split open. It released her, stumbling backward into the pit, its form unraveling into black smoke as it fell. Tendrils rose eagerly, wrapping around it and dragging it down into the depths. Elise collapsed at the edge of the pit, coughing and shaking. The whispers faltered again, growing faint and confused, and the heartbeats sputtered before fading entirely. Pit's glow dimmed until it was nothing more than darkness. She crawled away from the edge, her body heavy, her lungs burning. Behind her, the broken surface of the mirror began to knit itself back together, faintly glowing as though waiting for her to approach again. She turned to face it, her reflection staring back, but this time it looked like her. No hollow eyes, no stitched mouth. Just her, pale and bloodied but alive. The whispers were gone now, replaced by silence so deep it rang in her ears. Slowly, she approached the mirror and pressed her hand to its surface. It was cold, solid. Nothing happened. But in its depths, she thought she saw faint movement, countless eyes opening and closing, waiting. And then, faintly, her own voice from the other side. "You are not done yet." Her hand dropped, and she stepped back from the mirror. The chamber began to crack and crumble, the floor breaking apart as the walls collapsed inward. The air grew colder, filled with dust and falling stone, and she stumbled toward the stairs that spiraled back to the surface. As she climbed, the sound of the creature's whisper returned, soft now but still there, following her like a shadow. "We are always with you." Always. Chapter 9: The Return Above. Elise climbed the endless spiral staircase, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her hands raw from clutching the jagged stone. The whispers faded as she ascended, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant rumble of collapsing stone below. The sigils on her arms were nothing more than faint scars now, but they still tingled as though alive, a reminder of everything she had endured. At last, she reached the top of the stairs and stumbled through a narrow opening into what remained of Black Hollow Manor. The house was unrecognizable. The walls sagged inward, warped by some unseen force, and the air was thick with dust and ash. Faint beams of moonlight filtered through shattered windows, illuminating the ruins in pale silver. The air smelled of earth and rot, and every shadow seemed to twitch when she looked too closely. Elise pressed forward into the main hall, her footsteps muffled by layers of debris. Portraits on the walls were all blank now, their eyes gone, their faces erased, as though the house itself had forgotten who it once was. Her suitcase lay where she had left it on the dusty bench, though its surface was cracked and blackened, and the sigil carved into the door behind it glowed faintly. She reached for the suitcase but froze when she noticed something strange. The floor beneath it was slick and black, as if some of the pit's ichor had seeped through the foundations and spread here. The air around her shimmered faintly, and she could still hear the faintest echo of the creature's whisper, "We are always with you." Elise backed away from the bench, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The silence in the house was suffocating, and though she couldn't see them, she felt the weight of countless eyes watching her. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, soft at first but growing louder, closer. She spun around just as a figure stepped from the shadows, herself. The doppelganger's hollow eyes glowed faintly, its stitched mouth curved into something between a grin and a snarl. It raised its hand and pointed at her chest. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, and the sigils on her skin flared once more, brighter than ever. She stumbled backward as the figure advanced, its every step leaving black footprints on the floor. "You cannot run," it whispered, though its mouth never moved. "You opened the door. You brought us here." The words vibrated through her bones, and the walls of the manor groaned in response, as though the house itself agreed. She clenched her fists, feeling the last traces of the dagger's power coiling inside her. The doppelganger lunged at her, and she ducked instinctively, its claws slashing through the air where her throat had been. The force of its attack sent her crashing into the bench, splinters digging into her back. Before she could recover, the figure grabbed her by the hair, dragging her across the floor toward the pulsing sigil on the door. The whisper rose again, a chorus of voices now, chanting, "One must remain. One must feed." She kicked and fought, but its strength was inhuman, its grip unyielding. In a final burst of desperation, she twisted in its grasp and pressed her glowing palm to its hollow chest. The figure screamed, releasing her, as light flared from between the stitches of its mouth and eyes. The air shook violently, and the walls began to split and crumble around them. The doppelganger staggered backward toward the door, and Elise surged forward, slamming into it with all her strength. The two of them crashed through the sigil-carved doorway, tumbling into a darkness beyond. They fell together through nothingness, the void rushing past them in streaks of black and red. The creature shrieked in her ear, its claws digging into her arms as it tried to pull her down, but she kicked free, her hands glowing brighter with every heartbeat. With a cry of defiance, she struck it one final time, and it dissolved into smoke and ash, scattering into the void. The darkness shrank away from her touch, and she felt herself hurtling upward, as though the world itself was rejecting her. When she opened her eyes, she was lying outside on damp grass beneath a starless sky. The manor was gone, replaced by a barren field surrounded by jagged trees that seemed to reach for her. The faint glow of the sigils faded at last, and she lay still, staring up at the void above. The air was cold and silent, but somewhere far away she could still hear it, the heartbeat, faint but steady, waiting. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "It's not over." In the distance, on the horizon, she saw a faint shimmer, another mirror, standing alone among the trees, its surface rippling faintly as though inviting her. The wind carried the faintest echo of her own voice from beyond it. One more step. And as the whispers began to stir again, she forced herself to stand, her legs weak but steady, and began to walk toward it. Chapter 10, The Final Step. Elise walked slowly across the barren field, each step sinking slightly into the cold, damp earth. The faint shimmer of the mirror ahead glowed brighter with every breath she took, and the whispers swelled in her mind, urgent now, pleading, seductive. Around her, the jagged trees creaked and groaned as if alive, their branches twisting to follow her progress. The air grew colder still, and her breath came in ragged clouds that hung before her like ghosts. She kept her eyes locked on the mirror, its surface rippling like water, promising an end or a beginning. As she drew closer, she saw her reflection again, waiting. This time it looked exactly like her. Same wounds, same scars, same faint glow in the eyes, but it didn't move. Just stared, its expression unreadable. Behind it, faint shadows writhed within the glass, shapes too vast and alien to comprehend. The whispers rose into a chorus as she reached the edge of the mirror's light, her heart hammering as the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The reflection finally moved, raising its hand slowly, palm out, inviting her to do the same. Her hand shook as she lifted it, pressing her palm to the cold surface. The moment their hands met, the glass shuddered and a crack of blinding light split the air. The whispers turned into screams, furious and ecstatic at once, and the world around her dissolved into swirling darkness. She felt herself being pulled into the mirror, her body unraveling and reforming in ways she couldn't understand. Her breath caught in her throat as memories, hers but not hers, flashed behind her eyes. Lifetimes of opening gates, of feeding something ancient, of being both victim and warden. When the darkness receded, she stood in another field, under another sky. But this one was darker, the stars above black and shifting, and the ground beneath her feet thrummed faintly with that familiar heartbeat. The mirror stood behind her now, whole and silent, and in front of her stretched a long road flanked by endless rows of mirrors, each reflecting a different version of herself. Some whole, some monstrous, all watching her with quiet expectation. The whispers had gone silent at last, but their presence still pressed against her mind, patient and hungry. Far down the road, a figure waited, tall, robed, faceless. It raised a hand, beckoning her forward, and though every instinct screamed to run, her legs carried her onward. With each step, the mirrors beside her shimmered and cracked, revealing flashes of what lay beyond. Oceans boiling, skies collapsing, countless gates opening, and something vast and terrible pushing through them all. Yet through it all, she felt no fear anymore, only a strange, hollow acceptance that this was what she had always been walking toward. As she reached the figure, it stepped aside to reveal a final mirror, taller and darker than all the rest, its surface completely black. Her reflection stood within it, waiting, stitched mouth gone now, eyes glowing faintly with the same light that burned in her scars. The robed figure spoke at last, its voice deep and final. One must remain. One must feed. One must become. The reflection raised its hand again, and this time she didn't hesitate. She pressed her palm to the glass. The mirror's surface gave way beneath her touch, and she was pulled inside once more. Darkness enveloped her, but it no longer felt cold. Instead, it felt like coming home. Shapes moved around her, vast and silent, and the heartbeat she'd felt since Black Hollow Manor now thrummed in perfect rhythm with her own. The whispers returned, but now they were hers, rising from her lips and filling the void. We are here! We are awake. We are whole. When the light returned, she stood once more in the ruins of Black Hollow Manor, though it was quiet and empty now. The air was still, the sigils faded, the shadows retreating. She walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing faintly, and when she reached the doorway, she found her suitcase waiting, whole and untouched. She picked it up and stepped outside into the dawn, the first light in what felt like centuries washing over her skin. Behind her, the manor groaned and sank into the earth, swallowed by the same darkness she now carried inside her. She didn't look back. The road stretched ahead, lined with mirrors just out of sight, their faint whispers carried on the wind. She adjusted her grip on the suitcase, her scars faintly glowing under her coat, and began to walk. Each step felt heavier but also certain, as though she knew where she was going now and why. And far, far below the earth, in a pit that no longer had a gate, the creature stirred. Its countless eyes opened in the dark, and it smiled through her voice, whispered on the breeze. We are not done! We are never done!